the signal did not arrive like a warning. It arrived like a verdict. Every screen on Earth, every phone, every billboard, every television in every small apartment in every city across the planet went dark for exactly 3 seconds. Then a single image filled them all. A fleet. 4,000 warships hanging in space just beyond the orbit of Neptune, arranged in a formation so perfect it looked like mathematics made physical. Behind them, the stars looked small. The voice that followed was calm. It belonged to Grand Commander Vurak of the Cathari Dominion, a civilization 500 worlds strong and 3,000 years old. His translator spoke in every human language simultaneously. You have 72 hours. Surrender your colonies, ground your warships, accept tributary status under the Dominion, and your species will be permitted to survive. Refuse, and nothing in this solar system will remain. Then the screens went back to normal. Someone on a live broadcast in Seoul was still mid-sentence talking about a football match. The rest of the galaxy watched on their own feeds. The Luvari Confederation, humanity's closest diplomatic partner, immediately sent a private message to the UN. It said, "Please comply." The Drenari Trade Assembly sent a longer message explaining, in careful detail, the 14 species the Cathari had erased in the last century alone. Several other civilizations simply went quiet, the way neighbors go quiet when someone on the street is about to get hurt. Across the galaxy, analysts ran numbers. Cathari dreadnoughts outmassed anything humanity had launched. Their energy weapons were 2 generations ahead. Their shields had never been broken in open battle. Humanity had been in space for 200 years. The Cathari had been doing this for 3,000. The odds were not discussed seriously because there was nothing serious to discuss. The UN Security Council convened within the hour. The session was not long. Secretary-General Adiz Akafer, a former Lagos city planner who had spent 30 years in international diplomacy and had the kind of face that never gave anything away for free, read the ultimatum once. She set it down. She looked at the room. Recommendations. The room talked for 40 minutes. Some delegates were frightened. Some were practical. A few were already thinking about negotiation terms. One suggested they needed more time to assess military options. Adiz listened to all of it. Then she pulled her microphone closer. "We will not be surrendering. Draft the reply." The reply humanity sent back to Grand Commander Vurak was 11 words long. It said, "The United Earth government declines. We suggest you reconsider your position." When the translation reached the Cathari flagship, Vurak read it twice. He handed it to his intelligence officer, a lean officer named Drav, and asked if the translation was accurate. Drav confirmed it was. Vurak then asked if humans were known to have a ritual of formal defiance before surrender, the way some species did. Drav checked his files and said there was no record of such a custom. Vurak nodded slowly. He was not concerned. He had done this before. The Melvari had refused to, right up until the first 3 cities burned, after which their government signed whatever was placed in front of them. Species always made noise at the start. It meant nothing. What he did not know, what no one outside certain sealed military installations on Earth, Luna, and Mars knew, was that the moment the Cathari fleet had appeared on long-range sensors 6 days earlier, a single encrypted message had gone out to every human military command simultaneously. The message had no dramatic language. It had no call to arms. It was 2 words and a date. It said Ironshore now. In underground shipyards behind the Jovian moons, lights came on that had been dark for years. In hollowed asteroids throughout the belt, automated systems began their startup sequences for the first time outside of testing. On Luna, beneath the civilian domes that tourists visited for photographs, blast doors unlocked that most lunar residents did not know existed. In a briefing room deep inside Cheyenne Mountain, Admiral Soren, A short, gray-haired woman who had spent 20 years designing the thing that was now coming online, stood in front of a holographic display of the solar system and watched indicator lights turn from amber to green, one by one. Someone behind her said it was a miracle they had kept it secret this long. Soren didn't answer right away. She watched another light go green, then another. It wasn't a miracle, she said. It was 40 years of boring paperwork and nobody asking the right questions. She turned to her aide. Tell me when they crossed the orbit of Uranus. Outside on Earth's surface, people were frightened, reasonably so. They watched the alien fleet on news feeds and they called their families and some of them prayed and some of them just sat very still. It was honest fear and it made sense. But in certain rooms, in certain corridors, among certain people who had spent their careers quietly preparing for exactly this moment, there was something else entirely. It kept slipping out at odd moments. A grin at the end of a sentence. A short breath through the nose that wasn't quite a laugh but was close to one. The Cathari intercepted some of these audio feeds. Their analysts flagged the behavior as abnormal. They debated whether it was cultural, whether humans laughed when terrified, whether the translation software was missing something. One analyst submitted a report suggesting the humans might be reacting to information the Dominion did not have. The report was filed. Nobody read it that day. The Cathari fleet crossed the orbit of Neptune and kept moving. Intelligence officer Drav had a problem, and the problem was a folder. It had arrived on his desk 3 days before the fleet launched, forwarded from a deep-cover observation post that humanity did not know existed. The post had been watching Earth quietly for 11 years, logging ships, measuring energy outputs, cataloging public records. Standard pre-annexation surveillance. Drav had reviewed hundreds of these files for dozens of species. They were usually thin. Younger civilizations didn't have much worth noting. The human file was not thin. It was the largest pre-annexation intelligence package Drav had ever seen. Not because humanity was particularly powerful. Their official military numbers were modest, their public-facing warships few. The file was large because the analyst at the observation post had been thorough in a way that made Drav mildly uncomfortable. The analyst had not just recorded what humanity had. He had recorded what humanity had done. Drav started reading 3 hours before the fleet's arrival at Neptune. He was still reading when the first shot was fired. The first thing that caught his attention was the timeline of human warfare. Other species, most species, had periods of large-scale conflict, then long stretches of peace as populations stabilized and resource competition reduced. Humans did not follow this pattern. They had industrialized their wars. In the space of a single century on their calendar, they had managed to invent machine gun emplacements, aerial bombardment, chemical weapons, submarine warfare, nuclear bombs, and intercontinental missiles, and had actually used all of them on each other before they had ever left their own atmosphere. Drav had studied 41 civilizations. Not one of them had gone to space, still carrying the institutional memory of how to fight a nuclear exchange. Humans had. The second thing was the note at the bottom of the file, written by the observation post analyst in plain text without formatting, which meant it had been added late and in a hurry. It said, "Subject species displays unusual preparedness psychology. Public infrastructure does not match military infrastructure in ratio. Recommend full reevaluation of threat profile before action. This file is incomplete." The file was incomplete because the analyst had stopped transmitting 8 days ago. Nobody had followed up on why. Drav flagged this and sent it to his superior, a commander named Helv, who was busy managing fleet positioning, and told Drav to summarize it in one line. Drav wrote, "Human military capability may be significantly understated." Helv acknowledged the message and did not respond further. On Earth, meanwhile, Dr. Ravi Mehta was standing in front of a room full of senior military staff, giving a presentation he had been asked to prepare 2 years earlier and had hoped he would never actually need to deliver. The title on his first slide was, "What the Cathari Think They Know About Us." Ravi was a historian by training. He had spent 15 years studying how civilizations respond to existential threat, and he had a habit of saying uncomfortable things in the same mild tone people used to discuss the weather. He was very good at his job. He walked the room through the gap between what humanity looked like from the outside and what humanity actually was. From the outside, a young species, 200 years spacefaring, modest fleet, no confirmed war record against another space power, and colonies on only 3 bodies beyond Earth. Underdog by every measurable metric. From the inside, a species that had spent the better part of its recorded history in continuous conflict, had developed military logistics, mass production, psychological warfare, and adaptive tactics into something close to a cultural instinct. A species that had reached the moon on chemical rockets through pure refusal to accept that it couldn't. A species whose response to losing a battle, historically, was not to surrender but to industrialize harder. Someone in the room asked what the practical upshot was. Ravi clicked to the next slide. It showed the Project Ironshore construction timeline, laid alongside the official human fleet manifest that alien observers would have on file. The official manifest shows 80 warships, Ravi said. That number is accurate. He let the room sit with that for a moment. What it doesn't include is the 840 vessels that have never been registered, transmitted a beacon, or appeared in any public record. They've been parked behind Jupiter's moons for between 4 and 19 years, depending on the unit. Another pause. The Cathari are flying into a solar system that has had 40 years to turn itself into a fortress. They just don't know it yet. Nobody in the room laughed, but 2 of the generals exchanged a look that carried the same energy. Back on the Cathari flagship, Grand Commander Vurak was reviewing approach vectors. The fleet would pass the asteroid belt within 18 hours. His tactical staff had flagged the belt as a mild navigational consideration, debris density slightly above average, worth routing around for the smaller escort vessels. Nothing more. Vurak approved the route. He dictated a message to the Dominion Council. Resistance is symbolic. Expect full compliance within 6 hours of engagement. This will be brief. He sent it and returned to his maps. Drav, alone in his office, was now 90 pages deep into the incomplete human file. He had reached a subsection on human construction rates during periods of high threat. He read one line 3 times. It said that during their second global war, humans had gone from producing 40 warships a year to over 1,500 within a 24-month period. He looked at that number for a long time. He sent a second message to Commander Helv. This one said, "I believe we have made an error." Helv did not reply. The fleet was already moving. The debris field between Jupiter and Mars looked exactly like a debris field. That was, of course, the point. The Cathari fleet had spread into a standard approach formation, dreadnoughts at the front, carriers flanking, escorts threading the gaps. It was a formation that had worked on 14 species. It was clean, efficient, and had never once needed to change mid-approach because nothing had ever surprised them during this phase. The approach phase was the boring part. The real work came after. Leading Escort Pilot 7 was 200 kilometers ahead of the main fleet, threading her small craft through the outer edge of the asteroid belt when her proximity alarm went off. She checked her display. An ordinary rock. She turned 3 degrees and continued. The rock turned with her. She had exactly enough time to realize that the rock was not a rock before it detonated. The explosion that followed was not the explosion of a fuel source or a reactor. It was the controlled, shaped detonation of a mass driver charge that had been packed inside a hollowed asteroid and coated in material designed to read as inert on standard Cathari sensors. The blast took out 7 ships, and the 3 escorts flanking her before any of them had finished processing the alarm. Then the belt woke up. Not all at once. That was the second thing the Cathari had not expected. They had expected, if there was any trap at all, a single triggered event that could be identified and avoided. What they got instead was a cascade, charges detonating in sequence, each one positioned based on where the fleet would logically move to avoid the previous one. Someone had mapped every probable evasion route and placed a surprise at the end of each one. In 3 minutes, 212 Cathari ships were gone or disabled. The fleet had not yet fired a single shot in return. Grand Commander Vurak's first order was to pull the fleet back 2,000 kilometers and stop. His second order was to find out where the attack was coming from. His tactical officers spent 6 minutes arguing about it because the answer didn't make sense. The attack wasn't coming from a direction. It was coming from the belt itself, from everywhere, and it had no source to target back. Then the humans showed themselves. 840 warships came out from behind Jupiter's 4 largest moons simultaneously. They came in groups, each group at a different vector, so that there was no single facing direction for the Cathari fleet to orient against. They were smaller than Cathari dreadnoughts, most of them significantly smaller. On raw tonnage, the Cathari still had a massive advantage. Vurak looked at the numbers and allowed himself to breathe again. Then the humans started moving, and the numbers stopped being reassuring. Human fleet doctrine was not something any Cathari strategist had studied in depth, because no human fleet had ever fought a real engagement before and there was no data. What became clear in the first 4 minutes was that human ships did not fight in lines. They did not choose a facing and hold it. They moved constantly, unpredictably, aggressively, in tight swarm clusters that broke apart and reformed in new configurations before the Cathari targeting systems could lock. A cluster of 40 human frigates hit the flank of a Cathari dreadnought from 3 sides at once. The dreadnought's shields held the first salvo. The second salvo came from underneath while the dreadnought was adjusting, and the third came 4 seconds later before the shield rotation had completed. The dreadnought lost power to its aft section and drifted. Tactical Officer Bren, watching from the flagship, noted to Vurak that the humans appeared to be targeting shield rotation gaps deliberately. This required either exceptional real-time intelligence about Cathari shield mechanics or very fast pattern recognition under fire, or both. Vurak told Bren to destroy the nearest human cluster and stop commenting. Bren tried. 3 dreadnoughts turned their full weapons on a cluster of 30 human ships. They destroyed 9 of them cleanly. The other 21 broke formation, scattered into individual vectors, and reformed 2 minutes later behind a different part of the Cathari line. Nobody in the Cathari fleet had ever seen that. Losing a third of a unit and continuing to function was not standard. Most species, at that level of unit loss, either retreated or fell into defensive posture. The human ships just moved to a new attack position. Then Admiral Soren's flagship took a direct hit from a Cathari heavy weapon that would have split a Cathari cruiser in 2. Soren's ship did not split. It vented atmosphere from 2 decks. It lost 1 engine cluster. It kept firing. Damage control teams sealed the hull breach with a patch that was not supposed to work at combat speed. It worked. The ship moved to a new position and continued coordinating the battle. Drav, standing at the back of the flagship's bridge, watched this happen in real time on the tactical display. He did not say anything. He had already said the things he needed to say, and nobody had listened. He looked at the casualty count. The fleet had engaged for 11 minutes. 460 Cathari ships were gone. 63 human ships were gone. Those numbers were impossible. They were mathematically impossible given the relative sizes and technology ratings. And yet there they were, updating in real time, moving in the wrong direction. Vurak was staring at the same display. For the first time since the fleet had launched, he looked uncertain. He opened a channel to the Dominion and said the 4 words he had never said in 20 years of command. Send additional fleet support. The human ships kept coming, somewhere among them in a cockpit that smelled of recycled air and cooling metal. A pilot named Nora finished her 3rd attack run of the engagement, checked her ammunition count, and turned back for another pass without stopping. There was a doctrine in the Cathari military called the soft point principle. It was not written in any official handbook. It did not have a formal name. It was simply the thing every commander knew and used when a campaign stalled. If a species will not break from front pressure, find what they love and threaten that instead. Populations, homes, the places and people that soldiers leave behind when they go to fight. Every species had a soft point. Find it and apply pressure, and the military will fold regardless of how well it is performing. Varak had used it twice before. Both times it had ended the conflict within days. He looked at the casualty figures from the belt engagement. 600 ships lost now, the ratio still humiliating, and made the decision. He detached a strike force of 300 vessels from the main fleet and sent them on a wide arc around the engagement zone toward the inner solar system. Their orders were simple: hit the Mars colonies, not destroy them entirely, just enough. Burn the domes at Hellas Basin, take out the agricultural stations at cities, let Earth watch. His logic was sound. It had always been sound. Soldiers stop fighting when their homes start burning. The strike force arrived at Mars in 4 hours. What followed was not what Varek planned for. The Mars colonies hit back. Not with warships. Those were already engaged at the belt. Mars hit back with the planetary defense grid that had been built into the canyon walls and lava tubes beneath the surface over the course of 30 years of quiet construction. Railgun batteries that could fire a slug the size of a cargo container at a fraction of the speed of light. Point defense networks that filled local space with enough kinetic debris to shred unshielded hulls. The Cathari strike force lost 40 ships before they reached weapons range of the first dome. They hit the domes anyway. The bombardment was real. The agricultural station at a city's collapsed. 19,000 people were in the Hellas Basin complex when the strikes landed. Most survived because the emergency shelters held. Not all of them did. The death count reached 14,000 before the Cathari strike force pulled back, damaged, having lost 90 of its 300 ships. On Earth, the news came through live. Varak watched the human reaction feeds, waiting for what always came next: the public pressure, the calls for negotiation, the governments looking for an exit. None of that came. What came instead was silence, and then noise of a completely different kind. Every civilian shipyard on Earth, Luna, and the asteroid colonies simultaneously received emergency production orders. Reserve pilots who had been medically separated for age or injury submitted reinstatement, requests in the hundreds within the first hour. A weapons engineer in Bangalore sent an unsolicited message directly to the Naval Command with a targeting algorithm modification he had been sitting on for 2 years and thought might be relevant now. The message was forwarded up the chain within 20 minutes and implemented within 6 hours. And then there was Nora. She had been on her 9th combat sortie when the Mars strike news reached her cockpit. Her family was at Hellas Basin. She switched off the non-essential channels on her comms so she could think clearly, checked her fuel, and turned back toward the engagement zone without filing a verbal response to the notification. Her wing commander noticed she had gone quiet and checked in. She said she was fine. Her voice was level. Her targeting accuracy over the next 3 hours improved. This was not an isolated case. Military psychologists monitoring pilot communications noted a pattern across the fleet. The pilots who had direct personal connections to the Mars strikes did not break or become erratic. They became quieter and more precise. The Cathari tactical model for how attacked civilians affect soldier behavior was based on data from 14 species. In every prior case, Personal loss in the civilian population produced grief, then pressure on command to negotiate, then withdrawal. The Cathari had no category for what humans did, which was absorb the grief and convert it into sustained mechanical performance. Ambassador Gret of the Sulla Compact was watching the battle feeds from a neutral observation station 3 light hours away. He was 400 years old. He had watched the Cathari do this to the Melvari. He had watched them do it to the Torath. He had watched 8 species fold at exactly this point. He sent a personal message to Secretary General Adiz. It said, "I have watched 100 conflicts. I have never seen a species respond to civilian strikes by producing more weapons faster. I have one question and I am asking it genuinely. What are you?" Adiz read the message. She wrote back a response that was 4 sentences long. "We are a species that spent most of its history fighting itself. We learned early that if you want to stop an enemy from hurting you, you do not beg them to stop. You make them unable to continue. We stopped fighting each other because we got better things to do. We have not forgotten how." Gret read the reply twice. Then he forwarded it to the leaders of 6 other species who were watching the same feeds and had been quietly discussing whether to contact humanity. He added a single line at the top. "Read this carefully. I believe we have all been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about this species." Back at the belt, Admiral Soren received word of the Mars casualties. She took 30 seconds, standing at the side of her command console, saying nothing. Then she turned back to her tactical display. "New orders," she said. "We are no longer defending the belt perimeter. We are pushing them back to the outer system. All units advance." The human fleet moved forward. Varak, watching the movement on his display, felt something he had not felt during a military engagement in 20 years. He felt like he had made a mistake. The Cathari reinforcements arrived in 2 waves over 48 hours, dragged in from the nearest Dominion garrison worlds at the maximum sustainable FTL speed. By the time the second wave dropped out of jump, Varak had 6,200 ships in the solar system. It was the single largest fleet the Dominion had assembled in 400 years. The Dominion Council sent a message with the second wave that said, in formal language, that this matter needed to be resolved quickly and cleanly. The implication was clear. Varak had asked for help. Help had been sent. Finish it. Varak looked at his 6,000 ships, looked at his tactical display, and made the decision to push hard and fast through the belt, reach the inner planets, and end the campaign by weight of numbers alone. The human fleet had fought brilliantly. They had no answer for 6,000 ships. He advanced. The belt was strange. He had noticed it before but had attributed it to sensor distortion from the engagement debris. The asteroid density was wrong. Not dangerously wrong, not navigation hazard wrong, just wrong in the way that something hand-arranged is different from something natural. The spacing was too consistent in places. Some of the larger rocks were too perfectly round. His navigation officer noted this formally at the start of the advance. Varak ordered a sensor sweep. The sweep took 11 minutes. On the 12th minute, a kilometer-wide asteroid 30,000 kilometers off the port bow powered up. Not exploded, not fired. Powered up, running lights came on, energy signatures spiked, and a bay door the size of a city block opened in its side and launched 40 human fighters in 5 seconds. Then the rock next to it powered up, then the one behind that, then the one behind that. It went on for a very long time. What the Cathari fleet was sailing into and had been sailing through for 2 days was not an asteroid belt. Not entirely. It was a fortress. Human engineers had been boring into asteroids for 40 years and turning them into hardened military installations, repair bays, drone factories, missile stockpiles, railgun emplacements, and fighter launch platforms. Some of the larger asteroids had full crew quarters, medical facilities, and fabrication plants that could produce replacement parts for human ships mid-battle. The humans had not built a fleet to fight the Cathari in open space. They had built the solar system itself into the weapon. Varak understood this, with complete clarity, approximately 14 seconds too late. The Belt Fortress opened fire on all sides simultaneously. The next 6 hours were the worst 6 hours in Cathari military history. Railguns buried in rock fired at velocities that made shields nearly irrelevant. At that speed, kinetic energy bypassed the physics that energy weapons relied on to deflect. Drone swarms poured from asteroid bays in numbers that overwhelmed point defense systems through simple saturation. And the human ships, still fighting their shifting swarm tactics, were now operating from the fortress installations, pulling back to repair bays, rearming in minutes, and returning to the fight while Cathari ships had nowhere to go for repair because there was nothing behind them except empty space. On the Cathari flagship bridge, Tactical Officer Bren stopped giving updates at one point because the rate of casualty notifications had exceeded what the display could render clearly. He switched to a summary view. Every 30 seconds, the summary refreshed. The numbers went in one direction. Nora flew her 14th sortie of the campaign during Hour 3 of the Belt Battle. She was running on stimulants, and the particular focused calm that comes when a person has gone so far past exhaustion that they stop feeling it. Her target was the flagship's shield emitter array, a hardened installation that had survived 3 previous strike attempts. Admiral Soren had flagged it as a priority, but noted the point defense coverage made a direct approach nearly impossible. Nora did not take a direct approach. She took the approach that the point defense AI would calculate as least likely, a long looping arc that came in behind the signature of a drifting Cathari wreck, flying slow and cold, engines barely powered, coast gliding through the debris field like she had nowhere to be. The point defense system assessed her as debris for 43 seconds. On the 44th second, she lit the engines and closed the remaining distance in 6 seconds, and put all 4 missiles into the shield emitter at point-blank range before the targeting solution had updated. The flagship's shields dropped. Soren's voice came through the fleet channel 11 seconds later. It said 3 words, "All units, flagship." What happened to the Cathari flagship in the following 4 minutes was comprehensive. Varak survived. His bridge was intact. His ship was not. He stood in a command room that had lost external comms, weapons, propulsion, and most of its sensors, and was being held together by emergency systems that had a rated duration of 6 hours. He looked at what remained of his fleet on the one display that still functioned. The number read, 1,140 ships operational. He had arrived with 6,200. Bren beside him said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Varak picked up the emergency transmitter, the one that worked on a separate power cell, the one that was only for absolute last resort communications, and sent the retreat order. The Cathari fleet, or what was left of it, turned and ran. On observation platforms across the nearby star systems, species who had been watching in silence for 4 days watched the retreat happen in real time. The Luvari ambassador, who had sent humanity a message begging them to surrender, did not know what to say. She started composing a message 6 times and deleted it 6 times. Ambassador Gret watched the last ships vanish into FTL and said, quietly, to nobody in particular, "I am very glad they said no. The Cathari Dominion did not send another fleet. Not the next week, not the next month. They went quiet in a way that had no precedent in 3,000 years of Dominion history. The Council met in closed session for 11 days. Whatever was said in those sessions was not transmitted externally. The Dominion's border fleets, which normally moved through their territory on regular rotation, stopped moving. They parked. They waited. Humanity buried its dead. The memorial at Hellas Basin was built on the site of the collapsed agricultural dome. 14,000 names. Nora stood in front of it on a cold Martian afternoon with a few hundred other people, most of them family members of the dead, none of them speaking. The sky was its usual pale rust color. The temporary shelters that had housed survivors during the battle were still visible on the horizon, their solar panels turning slowly. She had been offered a commendation. She had acknowledged the notification and not responded to it. There would be time for that later, or there wouldn't. Right now, the names on the wall were more real to her than anything with a ribbon on it. Admiral Soren sent her a private message that said simply, "Well done. Rest." Nora read it, sent back a single word of acknowledgement, and went to stand in the wind for a while. The galaxy, meanwhile, was recalculating. The 6 species who had been Cathari tributaries, paying resource quotas, restricting their own military development on Dominion orders, hosting Dominion officials in their governments, began, very quietly, to reach out. Not to humanity directly, not at first. They reached out to Ambassador Gret, who had become an unofficial interpreter between humanity and everyone else who did not know how to start the conversation. Gret arranged meetings. Humanity sent diplomats who were careful and thorough and did not swagger, which impressed people more than swaggering would have. Within 3 months, 2 of the former tributaries had signed mutual security agreements with Earth. 3 others were in discussions. The 6th was watching and waiting, as was their custom, but their ambassador had stopped attending Dominion Council functions. The Luvari Confederation sent Secretary General Adiz a formal message of apology for their earlier advice to surrender. It was 3 pages long and extremely diplomatic. Adiz replied in 2 sentences that were warm and said the matter was closed, and she hoped they could focus on what came next. The Luvari ambassador, after reading it, reportedly held the message for a long time before filing it. The Cathari Dominion sent nothing. Then, 62 days after the battle, a single ship appeared at the edge of the solar system, transmitting diplomatic frequencies. Not a warship, a courier vessel, unarmed with a 2-person crew. It carried a sealed message from the Dominion Council. The message did not concede defeat. It did not use words like surrender or loss. It was written in the careful language of a very old empire that had never needed to write this kind of message before and was not entirely sure how. What it said, stripped of its formal phrasing, was, "We are willing to discuss terms." Adiz read it in her office with no one else present. She set it down and looked out the window for a moment at the city below, which was loud and ordinary and still standing. Then she picked it up and began drafting a reply. The reply was generous. This surprised many people, human and alien alike. There were voices on Earth that wanted punitive terms, wanted the Dominion publicly humiliated, wanted guarantees and reparations and formal acknowledgement of defeat. Adiz heard all of these voices. She understood them. She did not follow them. Her reply offered the Dominion a seat at a newly proposed Multilateral Security Council. It offered them trade terms that were fair and not humiliating. It offered to discuss the situation of the former tributary species through a neutral mediation process. It asked for nothing that could not be given without completely dismantling the Dominion's internal structure. And it contained one line that was not negotiable, written plainly at the end of the document without diplomatic softening. The Sol system, its colonies, and any world that enters into a security agreement with Earth are permanently removed from consideration as territorial acquisitions. This is not a position we will discuss. The Dominion Council sat with the reply for 9 days. Then they accepted the meeting. In the Dominion's intelligence division, a junior analyst named Preth had been assigned the task of compiling a full retrospective on the Sol campaign, what went wrong, why it went wrong, and what the intelligence failures had been. It was not a prestigious assignment. Nobody wanted to write the report that explained how the most powerful military in the known galaxy lost 6,000 ships to a species they had rated as a minor threat. Preth was thorough. He worked through the original surveillance files, Drav's flagged warnings, the incomplete pre-annexation report, the intercepted communications from the 72-hour ultimatum period. He read all of it. He cross-referenced it with the battle data. He came, eventually, to the audio files that earlier analysts had flagged as abnormal, the recordings from human military briefing rooms during the ultimatum window, the ones where humans had been laughing. He listened to them carefully this time, not as a cultural anomaly, as data. He understood it now. They had not been laughing out of madness. They had not been laughing out of bravado or ignorance or some alien expression of fear. They had been laughing the way someone laughs when they have spent years preparing for a test, and the test has finally arrived. The relief of it, the release of waiting, the grim, private satisfaction of knowing that the thing they had built in secret and maintained in silence and never been allowed to explain to anyone was finally going to speak for itself. They had been ready. Preth finished his report. He filled in all the required fields: date, author, classification, conflict reference. He reached the final field, threat assessment, current. He looked at the cursor for a long time. Then he typed one word: Apex. He saved the document. He closed it. He sat in his chair and thought about what a species looks like when it has spent 200 years in space, 10,000 years of recorded history, and most of that history learning how to survive things that should have killed it, and what it looks like when that species finally decides it is done being polite. He thought about it for a while. Then he went home, because there was nothing more to say.